Hey everyone. So in this video, I am going to go over the PowerPoint on drafting research papers. So hopefully at this point you are fairly certain of the sources that you're going to be using for your paper, or at least you're getting there. For project part 2, you were supposed to list the sources that you had at that point. You're allowed to use more than just the 2 or 3 sources that are required, and maybe you hadn't found all of them yet by the time you were supposed to complete project part 2. So if you're not there yet, having found all of your sources for sure, hopefully you're getting there soon, because next week you will be assigned the rough draft. So it's getting close. We've talked about, we've gone over the basics of APA format, how to get started on a research paper. We've looked at, how to do the reference entries and how to do the citations. But now it's time, especially since the rough draft will be assigned next week, it's time to start thinking about how you then, take your ideas and the information that you have found in your sources and then put that into essay form. How do you start to draft a research paper? So that's what we're going to look at today. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. I'll get you in presentation mode here. All right, so drafting research papers, from researching to writing. All right, so the first thing you want to do is you want to sort of look at all of the information that you have gathered from your sources. Review your findings. Go back to the research questions that you had, maybe even like in project part 1, or maybe just questions and ideas that you have thought of along the way as you've been thinking about the topic, researching the topic. Come back to those questions or those ideas to see if you still need to, or if you still want to sort of address those ideas and those questions in the paper. And if so, do you have all of the information you need, right? Did you answer the questions, or did you explore the ideas and thoughts that you had about the topic? Basically, do you feel like you're ready? Do you feel like you have your own ideas that are, clearly about certain aspects of your topic? Do you still have any questions about your topic? Or do you feel like you're ready? You have been thinking about the topic, you've been researching the topic, you are clear on your focus, you already have an idea of what your main points are going to be, the main ideas that you're going to cover in the essay. You feel like you have researched it enough, that you have a variety of sources, and you know how you're planning on using those sources for the most part. Do you feel like you have done enough of the prep work? If so, then you need to start going a little deeper with the topic and your research. Think about all of the information you have found from different sources. Are there any connections between those sources? Are there any differences between the sources? Are the sources working together in some way in your paper, or have you really just sort of got like one or two sources for this main point, and then you just completely kind of switch, and the sources that you're using in these other main points really are only about those ideas. You just want to think more about the information that you have gathered from your sources and how they're all going to work separately or together in the body of the paper, how they're going to filter into your own ideas and thoughts about your topic. So remember, the point of doing a research paper like this is not to simply regurgitate information from other sources. You need to have your own ideas about your topic. And those sources are there to simply help support your ideas. Now, sometimes when you're doing research, the information that you're coming across can inform your own ideas, meaning you might learn something new about your topic and want to incorporate that into your paper. But you still need to have your own ideas about that new information. You need to sit and think about it for a little while instead of just, coming across new information from a source and saying, oh, that's really interesting, I'm going to include it, without really giving it any thought of your own. So it's not to say that you need to have all of the answers and know everything about your topic before you do any research on it. The research, can change your thought process about your topic as well. And that's okay. That happens. That's a pretty natural thing. But you just want to remember that at the end of the day, the paper that you write, it needs to be yours. It needs to be your ideas for the most part. Incorporate that source information to support your ideas and to give credibility to your ideas. But you have to figure out and decide how to use the source information effectively in the paper along with your own ideas. So you need to start thinking about that. Maybe you already have, as you've been collecting your sources. But if you haven't really sat down and thought about it yet, you need to before you start drafting. You need to have an idea of how all of your source information is going to work. And you have to decide the best way to do that. You want to imagine your paper as well. Like, in your mind, how is this paper going to read? What ideas are you going to talk about first? What makes the most sense to talk about first? What would be most effective to talk about first? What does that lead into? What's the next section of the essay going to be like? What main idea or point should you save for the last part of the essay? Humans have a tendency to remember best what we see or hear last. What we see or hear in the beginning and the middle can get a little fuzzy, but we're pretty good at remembering the end of something. So that's why we typically save our most important main point, our sort of the biggest punch, what we feel is the most important thing. We kind of save that as our last main point and then our conclusion. So what do you envision being, the most important main point, the most important information about your topic? So you want to just start thinking about how the layout of the paper is going to look. Where are you going to start and where are you going to end? And then figure out the best way to construct the middle part as well. And again, be thinking about how you're going to incorporate your source material in each of those sections. Thinking about using information from your source that will truly help support your ideas and truly show why you chose that source in the first place. You don't want to paraphrase or quote something from a source just for the heck of it. You want to make sure that what you are taking from that source has substance, that it's worth incorporating into the paper. So you might have a source, you might have read an article, and the information in it is really pertinent to your topic, and it's really a good source to use. But when it comes to actually choosing the information that you're going to include in your essay, sometimes students have a tendency to choose information that it isn't even the best thing about the source. they're pulling a direct quote from the introductory paragraph, or the, and it's like, you're wasting a quote there, basically, because pulling that quote in does nothing really to further the ideas that you're presenting at that time. You want to make sure that you're using source material of substance that will have an impact on the point you're trying to make. So think about how you're going to organize your main points, but also think about what source information you're going to include in each section, and ask yourself, is this effective? Is this the right information from this source? Am I using the source as best as I can? Or is it just there so that I can put it on my reference list and have the citation because it's required? Don't do that. Use the sources, respect the source. If it has good information, then show us. Incorporate that in some way, okay? All right. Whoops. Once you have sort of thought about some of those more abstract things, you want to come back to your working thesis. Now, I think that it's okay to allow the working thesis to stay a working thesis all the way up until you have finished your draft and spent some time with it and are sure that that's really what you want your paper to be. If once you are completely certain that your paper is good to go, then you come back to the thesis for the last time and make sure that it is exactly as it should be. But when you start drafting the paper, it's still a good idea to sharpen the working thesis that you started with, probably in project part 2. You want to make sure, because the closer you get it to being set, the more direction it will give you as you draft your paper, and the less you'll probably have to refine it at the very end. So I don't want you to think that, taking this step here before you start writing the draft, sharpening your thesis here means that it's set in stone now. It's never set in stone until you're ready for it to be set in stone. But working on it now, before you start the draft, again, is a good idea. You want to use rich, clear terms. You want to try to avoid anything that's too vague, any language that's too vague, too broad. You want to make sure that you're using terms that are tangible, that are not abstract, and that are clear. You also might want to introduce qualifying terms where needed and not make it seem so absolute. You guys aren't necessarily writing argumentative research papers, though, so I don't know that this is something that a lot of you will necessarily need to think about, but you do want to phrase your thesis in a way that sounds reasonable, and not so demanding or inflexible. You want it to be clear and you want it to be strong, but you don't want it to sound so absolute that people will think that you are not open to others' opinions. The first thing that you need to work on, though, is making sure that it's clear and that it's focused and specific and not vague and not broad. So we're going to take a look at how you can accomplish that. So we have a sample working thesis statement here. It says, Batman's personality is more complex than Superman's. So this is what we started off with. For instance, if this was what I was asked to do for project part 2, you know, I have a good idea of my topic, and, you know, I'm finding my sources. Where do I envision this paper going in that early stage? I know that I want to talk about how Batman, his personality is more complex than Superman's. That's where I started, and that was a decent place to start. It got the ball rolling for me. But is it focused enough? Can I still leave that as my thesis statement in the final draft of my essay? Is it focused enough? Well, think about it. Are we talking about every version of Batman and Superman? Are we including the comic book versions, the cartoon versions, all the different movie versions? Like, that seems like too much. That's too much for a 5-page paper. So which versions are we most interested in? Where did our research take us? You know, you got to think about these things. Well, it turns out that what we were most interested in, and therefore what most of our research kind of centered on, was actually the comic book versions. So let's revise that thesis statement to make that clear. In the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Batman's personality is more complex than Superman's. So it's a little better. At least, you know, we're narrowing in a little bit. We're not even worried about television and movies. We're looking and we're not even talking about current comics. We're looking specifically at the early editions of Batman and Superman comics. So that narrowed our focus quite a bit. But there's still some problems with this thesis statement. Still, is it focused enough? Because there's this whole other part that we haven't looked at yet. So are we talking about each character in their superhero form? Like, are we really just looking at Batman when he's Batman and Superman when he's Superman? Are we also talking about their everyday alter egos, Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent? Because that seems like too much. If we're talking about Bruce Wayne and Batman and Clark Kent and Superman, that's a lot. So again, where did our interest actually lie? Where did most of our research happen to fall? Well, it turns out we were actually thinking more. We said Batman and Superman in the working thesis statement, but what we were really thinking and what we kind of ended up researching was actually about Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent. So we need to revise the thesis statement to make that clear. So in the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Bruce Wayne's personality is more complex than Clark Kent's, right? Now, is this specific enough? We've got the focus, right? Early editions of the comics, Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent. But there's that whole middle section there. Personality is more complex. What part of their personalities are we really talking about? Personalities are made up of a lot of different things, you know, too many to talk about in just one essay. So what exactly do we need when we say that Bruce Wayne's personality is more complex than Clark Kent's. What does that even mean? Well, what we've actually been looking at and where our research took us actually has to do with Bruce Wayne being more of a, glass half empty kind of guy, kind of a Debbie Downer sometimes, while Clark Kent is more of a glass half full kind of guy, right? Much more peppy. So we need to get that into the thesis statement instead of just saying personality is more complex. We need to figure out a way to state this aspect of their personalities. So in the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Bruce Wayne is more pessimistic than Clark Kent. Wow. Our original version, right? Batman's personality is more complex than Superman's. That was a good starting place. That was a good working thesis statement to get us going, right? To get the ball rolling for us so that, we at least had some idea of the focus of our topic. But it's clear that that working thesis statement is not strong enough for a college level essay. It needed to be refined. And we won't really know how it needs to be refined until we've done the research, thought about the topic, thought about what it is we are actually trying to say in the essay, and then we're able to go back to each component of the thesis statement and sharpen it, right? Until we get to a version of it that is focused and specific. We're no longer broad and vague. We're focused and specific. Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit more about these thesis statements, and making sure you understand what makes a thesis statement a good thesis statement. And keep coming back to those two words, focused and specific. So we have an example right here. It says, when teenagers marry, they face 3 serious problems that threaten their happiness. That's a decent thesis statement. If I were to read that at the end of an introductory paragraph, I would know, for the most part, what to expect in the rest of that essay. I would know that the rest of the essay is going to talk about the serious problems that threaten the happiness of teenagers who get married. Now, I would have known even more about what the essay would entail if this author had listed the 3 serious problems that they're going to look at in the essay. But at least this doesn't leave me wondering, I still don't know, I'm not sitting there thinking, I still really don't know where this paper's going. I read the introductory paragraph and pretty sure I understand what the topic is, but I really don't know what this essay is going to do. At least with this thesis statement, I do have a fairly good idea. It'd be even better, though, if those 3 problems had been listed. Same thing with our second version here. Prize fighting is a dangerous sport that should be banned in the United States. I can read that thesis statement and have a pretty good idea of what that essay is going to include. They're going to explain the reasons why it's dangerous. But it would have been better if they had listed the reasons in the thesis statement as well. It would just give me even more clarity as I move into the body of the essay. And then we have this version down here, our third example. Soap operas are popular because they entertain, inform, and help to fulfill the viewer's emotional needs. That's a really strong thesis statement. It is focused, it is specific, and it lists the main points of the essay. I know if I read that thesis statement at the end of the introductory paragraph, I am fairly certain that the next section after the introduction will be a section that explains how soap operas entertain. And I know that the section after that is going to explain how soap operas inform. And I know the section after that is going to explain how soap operas help to fulfill the viewer's emotional needs. I, as a reader, know what to expect now when you give me a thesis statement that is that strong, that focused, that specific. So this is what you want to shoot for. You want to shoot for a thesis statement that is focused, specific, and somehow lets the reader know what the main points, the organization of the essay. Because it's not just what your main points are, it's also the organization. Because when I read that thesis statement, you know, soap operas are popular because they entertain, inform, and help to fulfill the viewer's emotional needs. Again, like I said, I'm expecting the first body paragraph or the first section of the body to be about how soap operas entertain. But if I finish reading the introductory paragraph and the first section is about how they fulfill the viewer's emotional needs, that's going to be a little off-putting, because in your thesis statement, you listed that main idea last. Why are you discussing it first? Right? So the thesis statement, including your main points in it, allows you to show the reader the organization of your essay. But you have to make sure that it matches up, right? The order is totally up to you, right? You have to decide the best order of your main points, like I mentioned earlier. But once you have decided, make sure that you list everything in the same order in your thesis statement. Make it match up. So as long as this essay followed that pattern, right? The first body section is about entertaining, then informing, and then fulfilling the viewer's emotional needs, then that's a fantastic thesis statement. It sets me up to know what to expect. And then when you deliver on those expectations, I'm satisfied as a reader, and you gain credibility as an author, because you said this is what you were going to do in the essay, and that's exactly what you did. You can't really ask for much more than that. Okay. So we're going to take a look at two paragraphs here and see if we can identify the thesis. We have this one over here, right? Now, it's interesting because this is a sample introductory paragraph from a narrative essay. And a narrative essay is one where you tell a story, right? Typically, they're personal narratives, so it's a story about something that you've experienced, right? And narratives don't necessarily, stories don't necessarily have a traditional strong thesis statement like other academic essays would, but there's still an idea in this introductory paragraph that tells us what to expect in the rest of the story, what the story is going to be about. So it says, it's easy to note the behavioral dark spots in those around us. My father is a skinflint. When I need a loan or simply extra cash, he turns a deaf ear to my pleading hysterics. Mom is excessively moody. When something bothers her, she sulks for hours, never revealing what set her off, and we just have to wait until she gets over it. However, as a fairly normal teenager, I never thought of myself as having any particular character flaws. Yet, as I faced my brother Matthew at his bedroom door one spring afternoon last year, I became aware of the ugly features of anger and temper in my personality. This story is not going to be about their dad. It's not going to be about their mom. And it's not even really going to be about the brother. But we do know that the rest of this essay is going to tell the story of what happened, whatever it was that happened, standing in the brother's bedroom doorway last year. And we know that somehow whatever happens in that moment has made the author aware of their anger and temper. Now we just keep reading to get the whole story. But they let us know right here in that last sentence exactly what the focus of the story was going to be. We have more of a traditional introductory paragraph over here on this side. It says, every day the newspapers and television and radio news programs are flooded with stories about the tragic results of drug addiction. This is an old example, and you can tell by the statistics. Indeed, in the past year, over 2,000 people died from drug abuse in the United States alone. So much higher than that now. About 200 of those victims were teenagers who were probably just satisfying their natural curiosity or were searching for a few thrills and got more than they bargained for. Their deaths provide the most dramatic evidence that experimenting with drugs can be physically, psychologically, and socially destructive. What is this paper going to be about? What is the rest of this essay going to discuss? It's going to discuss how experimenting with drugs can be physically destructive to teenagers, how it can be psychologically destructive to teenagers, and how it can be socially destructive to teenagers. That's a really strong thesis statement. It is focused and specific. So specific, it even includes the main points that will be discussed in the essay. So as you are sharpening your thesis, these are the things you want to keep in mind, trying to get it to that point where it is super focused and super specific and includes the main points that you're going to discuss in the essay and in the same order that you're going to discuss them in. That's what we want. Now, that's our working thesis statement, sharpening it, right? But that's just one sentence, right? One sentence of the whole introductory paragraph, one sentence in the whole essay. So now we want to start thinking about what we're doing in the rest of the essay. So we want to consider methods of organization. And again, you have the control over this, and you want to let several things sort of feed into how you decide to organize your main ideas. But first, here are some things that you should not do. Do not give me a high school hamburger, meaning the 5-paragraph essay. We are often taught to write essays in this way when we first start learning how to do essays. And even when we come back to college sometimes and we really, and we're still learning the expectations of college level composition, we still sometimes start with the 5-paragraph essay. Introductory paragraph, 3 body paragraphs, 1 for each main point, and then a concluding paragraph. But once you get to a certain level, you're going to be expected to have more complex topics, more complex ideas about your topic. And therefore, it's not 5 paragraphs won't be enough. It will not be enough to fully cover and explore the topic you've chosen. If you have a 4-page paper, and it's still just 5 paragraphs, right? Like you're getting close to meeting the page requirement. Let's say it's 5 pages. 5 pages, and you've still only got 5 paragraphs. What that probably means is your 3 main points in the middle of the essay, you shoved everything about your first main point into one big, huge, long paragraph, and you forgot the rules of paragraph development. Same thing with your second main point and your third main point. But remember the rules of paragraph development. If you are dealing with complex ideas, your first main point could take several paragraphs to fully develop it, to fully explain it and cover it. So, for instance, going back here to this sample thesis statement about teenagers experimenting with drugs, their deaths provide the most dramatic evidence that experimenting with drugs can be physically, psychologically, and socially destructive. This first section here about how experimenting with drugs can be physically destructive to teenagers, I would expect way more than just one paragraph. I would imagine that talking about the physical effects of drug use would, because there's probably several physical effects, and you're not going to jam all of those into one paragraph. You're going to talk about each one separately. Maybe even, there might even be a physical effect, one physical effect that still takes 2 or 3 paragraphs to explain. And then you've got another physical effect that you're still going to look at, and then maybe a third physical effect you're still going to look at. So that first main point could take 5 or 6 paragraphs to get through. You have to remember that you are expected now to fully develop your ideas, to fully develop your main points, and sometimes that requires multiple paragraphs, because you also have to remember the rules of paragraph development, that each paragraph should have one focus, right? Now, if you're just going to briefly summarize the physical effects, then maybe that would only take 1 paragraph. But that's not what you're really supposed to be doing here. You're supposed to be fully explaining the physical effects. So you got to fully explain it, man. And that can take numerous paragraphs. The section on how drugs are psychologically destructive, that could take numerous paragraphs. Socially destructive, numerous paragraphs. So that's what I mean when I say don't give me a high school hamburger. Fully develop your main points. If you feel like you can cover one main point with 1 paragraph, I highly suggest you do 2 things. First, look at that 1 paragraph. Did you stay on topic? Is there only one idea discussed in that paragraph? If there's more than one idea discussed, then you need to break it up into other paragraphs. Because again, the rules of paragraph development, right? It's all under one main point, but every time you switch to a new aspect of that main point, you switch to a new paragraph. If that's, you look at that paragraph and it is focused on one topic, but it's only 1 paragraph, then the next thing you need to do is fill it out more, develop it more, because it's probably not going to cut it. It's probably not going to be at the level that is required and expected of you. So, no high school hamburger. Do not simply regurgitate information. You must analyze and synthesize the information from your sources, not just, plunk it in there. It needs to be incorporated. Every time you use information or refer to information from a source, it has to be incorporated into your own writing, your own ideas, and you need to explain that source information. Don't think that it can speak for itself. You're the writer of this essay. You're the author of these ideas. If you're going to bring source information in at a certain point, then you are responsible for showing us why it's important, connecting it to your ideas. We're going to look a little bit more at the technical aspect of integrating sources in the next lesson this week. But only you can determine how the sources are connecting with your own ideas, because they're your ideas, right? But you cannot skip that step. You have to analyze and synthesize. And do not give me just a series of source summaries. Remember, this is your paper, your ideas, 80% your own ideas and words, 20% from source material. Okay? So, thinking about then how to approach the body of the essay, you have to think about your own ideas, the source information that you're using, and how to best present each of your main ideas. Along the way, you have to think about where you're going to include the source information. If you've got a main point that takes 5 paragraphs to discuss, you might not necessarily need to refer to source information in every single paragraph of that main point. So where are you? Where is the source information coming into play? You have to think about that. All right. I want to go ahead and move forward here, though, because there's 2 drafting strategies that gets discussed in this PowerPoint. The first is writing freely. So this is where you're going to kind of take a look back at your working thesis and all your notes, everything that you've gathered, all of your own ideas, information from your sources, and then you're just going to set everything aside. And if you need to, you might jot down a brief scratch outline. And I am going to show you an example of a scratch outline right here. So the scratch outline is basically just very basic information that you have in your mind right now as to how you're going to organize things. So, you know your first paragraph is going to be your introduction. And you're going to have to introduce the topic. You also know what your working thesis statement is, so type it out or write it out if you're handwriting it. This particular student, the first section after the introduction, they've decided they need to provide some background information, right? So background information, what are the basic ideas that you're going to include in that section on background information, right? Their first main point, employment conditions and physical health. All right, so what are the main ideas that they're thinking about including? What is it that they want to make sure they hit on when they are in this section? They want to make sure they talk about injuries and recovery time, right? Their second main point, employment conditions and mental health. So what are the main ideas they want to make sure they include? Levels of stress and stress linked to mental health issues. All right, so we write those down under that section. And then main point number 3, physical health and mental health linked. What do we want to make sure we touch on in that section? We want to make sure we touch on how both are connected. We also want to make sure we touch on how stress can manifest in physical ways. And then our fourth main point are financial worries that lead to more stress and poor physical health. So what do we want to make sure that we cover in this last main point? How dropping out of school can lead to financial issues, how financial issues are linked to other problems that affect mental and physical health. And then the last section of the essay is going to be our conclusion. What do we need to do in the conclusion? We need to, of course, somehow restate our thesis, refer back to it. And we also want to discuss what next? What should the next steps be for this topic that we're writing about? So the scratch outline does not include a lot of super specific information. The working thesis statement is pretty specific. And, you know, we do have a pretty good idea of the skeleton of our essay. We know what the first section is going to be after the introduction, and we know basically what we want to include in that section. We don't know, you know, it's just, these are just our thoughts right now. You know, we know what our first main point is going to be and what we want to make sure we cover in that section, and so on and so forth. It's just jotting down ideas and creating, again, the skeleton of the essay. So this person has this outline now, and even though it's very basic, it still gives them direction. It still gives them something to refer back to. Because especially if you're not writing the whole draft in one sitting, like let's say, you know, you've got an hour on one day and you're going to try to get through as much as you can, right? And you get through the introduction, background information, and that first main point, maybe even only halfway through the first main point. And then your hour's up and you got other places you need to go. Having the outline, then when you come back the next time to pick up where you left off, you don't have to try to remember the plan you had. You have it written down and you just go back to it, kind of think about it for a few minutes to remind yourself, you know, of why you chose to organize it that way, and, you know, make sure you're clear on your own ideas, basically. But it's there, and you just refer right back to it and keep going, pick up where you left off. So even though it's very basic, this scratch outline is super helpful. It helps writers feel a little more secure in the draft they're working on, because you have a preconceived notion of what each section should cover. You're less likely to get lost in the essay. You're less likely to lose your way. You're less likely to go off topic. You're less likely to accidentally leave something out, right? It's such a useful tool. So even if it's just a scratch outline, I highly suggest utilizing one. And if you've never done it before, try it. And then let me know. Send me a message, because my experience says that when students take an extra 15-20 minutes to do a scratch outline before they start drafting, it saves them hours of frustration and energy and time and work in the drafting process and in the revision process. So taking the time, just a little bit of time, to do a scratch outline in the beginning, it pays off tremendously. Saves you so much down the road. All right, so let's go back to our PowerPoint here. That's weird. Why are there two? All right, so you got your scratch outline, and then you just start writing. Get all of your research-based thinking. That doesn't mean including your sources yet. That just means all of your thoughts about the topic, without really stressing about the details and flow. I mean, you have that scratch outline to help you, but otherwise don't worry, because having the scratch outline allows you to just write without stressing about the details in the flow. You at least have the basic structure, and then you can just go with it in each section. This step, if you do it this way, writing freely, without where you just put everything aside. The only thing that you're really going to use is that scratch outline. You're not going to include any source material yet. You are simply getting your ideas in the essay. You'll write the draft as if you didn't do any research at all. It will be 100% your own ideas and words at that point. After you have finished the draft, then you go back to your notes, develop your draft further, and then you're going to start figuring out where to integrate and cite your research material. This is a good method because it helps ensure that the paper is truly grounded in your own ideas and words, and that you're not overusing the source material, or that it doesn't end up being just a string of citations in the essay. It does require a little more time after that first draft to then go back in and figure out where to incorporate your source material. But if you're worried that you're not going to be able to separate the two, that if you're worried that the paper isn't going to have enough of you in it, and that you are going to bring in too much source information, then this might be a method for you to try, because then you get the first draft of the essay and it's totally you, 100% you. Then you can go back, and because you're going to remember some of the things that you read in your sources, you're going to remember what you want to discuss. And then after you've written the draft, you're going to have the source material there to then figure out how to incorporate in each section of the essay. It's not like if you do this without looking at your sources, that the draft you produce is then going to invalidate the sources you had prepared. It's not like you're suddenly just going to completely switch tracks and now the sources you found are irrelevant and don't even fit. That's not going to happen, I promise. If you have read the sources already, if you're familiar with the sources, which you should be, because otherwise, why did you choose them if you haven't already read through them and thought about them? So if you've done that, then putting everything aside and just writing the draft 100% with your own ideas and words, you'll be able to figure out how to incorporate that source material. If, though, you're not really liking that idea and you're more inclined to include the source material as you write the draft the first time, you can then kind of come to this method here, which is a little more systematic. And, I have used both methods. Sometimes I can write freely and then figure out where to include the source material. I always have an outline, though. Most of the time, they're pretty detailed outlines, like the one we're about to take a look at. Even if I write freely, sometimes I still, my outlines can be pretty detailed. That's just me. So for a more detailed sample outline, let's take a look here. So this was the same topic, same main points and everything as the sample scratch outline that we looked at, but we're going to see where the differences are a little bit. All right, so now for our introductory paragraph, remember before we just had introduce topic and thesis statement. Now in a detailed outline, we're going to actually make a note of exactly how we want to introduce the topic. All right, so current problem, that educational attainment rates are decreasing in the United States while healthcare costs are increasing. We also know in that introductory paragraph, we want to talk about population and area of focus. We want to make sure our readers know that we're going to be discussing unskilled or low-skilled adult workers. All right, our thesis statement is still the same. Remember, The first section after the intro on our scratch outline was background information, right? And this now is what we're looking at. Historical employment overview. How unskilled laborers in the past were frequently unionized and adequately compensated for their work. Make a note of which sources you're using, if any, for this information. So when you're making this outline, here in this section, whatever it might be, every time you make a point on your outline, if you are using source information in that specific location, then make a note on your outline of which source you're using. I would even make a note if that particular section is totally your own ideas and there's no source information being worked in, make a note of that too. Instead of here on this line right here, instead of typing out which source you're going to use, type out no source. That way you are clear in your own mind that that section, there's no source for it. It's totally your own ideas. So, and that's pretty much how the outline goes. We have, our background, our section on background information is going to include a section on historical employment overview. Here's the main idea of that little section. And if we're going to use a source there, we're going to make a note of it. The second part of this section on background information is going to be about historical healthcare overview. Here's the main idea we're going to talk about in that little section. We're going to make a note if a source is going to get used there. The next section of background information is the current link between education and employment type. This is the main idea we want to make sure we hit in that little section. We're going to make a note of any sources that we might be using. And then the last section of background information is on gaps in the research. We're going to make a note of the main idea we want to hit in this section, and then make a note of any sources we might be using. Our first main point, after we give all the background information that we feel like we need to provide, our first main point is conditions of employment affect workers' physical health. Our first main idea in our first main point is that unskilled work environments are correlated highly with worker injury. Make a note of any sources we might be using in this first main idea. The second main idea for our first main point is that unskilled work environments rarely provide healthcare or adequate injury recovery time. We're going to make a note of the sources we're using in that section. So I can kind of see right now that our first main point will have at least 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph is going to be on this information. The second paragraph is going to be on this information. That's possible. This isn't my paper. It's possible that the first main idea might need 2 paragraphs. Maybe the second main idea here only needs 1. But at the very least, I can see, I can see that my first main point will have at least 2 paragraphs. 1 for my first main idea, 1 for my second main idea. And then same thing for my second main point. So you follow the same pattern in each section, right? What your main point is going to be, that's the part in green here. What your main ideas are going to be within each main point, and that's what I put in blue. For every main idea, jot down something that reminds you what that main idea is supposed to be, and then make a note of the sources that you're going to use, if any, for that main idea. When you sit down to write this draft now, it's almost like you're just filling in the blanks. You have such a good structure for the essay right now that you could probably write it in record time. This outline takes a little longer to make than the scratch outline did. So let's just say that the scratch outline would take 15, 20 minutes to create before you start drafting. The detailed outline might take an hour, maybe a little longer, depending on how many sources you have, that sort of thing. I would imagine for most of the topics for the course project, though, doing a detailed outline, as long as you have everything that you need, then it shouldn't take more than an hour. But taking that hour up front to do the detailed outline saves you even more time in the drafting process than the scratch outline does. I mean, the scratch outline saves you a significant amount of time. Don't get me wrong, the scratch outline, it's still super useful. The detailed outline, though, it's almost like then the paper almost writes itself. So if you've got it in you to do the detailed outline, it's so much easier, so much less stress and anxiety to then actually draft the paper, because you now have a very clear vision of almost every single paragraph of the essay. And again, now you just got to fill it in. So either way, use the outline. one or the other, scratch or detailed. They're just so useful. But again, so after you've created your detailed outline, everything's gonna be so precise. You're gonna just write methodically. You're gonna follow your thesis, follow your outline, look at the sources. Every time you've made a note that a source is gonna get used in a section, you go to that source. You know, I have even done a detailed outline where when instead of just saying, oh, for this main idea, I'm gonna use this article, I will actually put on my outline, for this main idea, I'm going to use this article, specifically the third paragraph on page 2. And that way when I go to draft it, I know exactly where I need to look to incorporate the source information that I had wanted to use. So the outline can be as scratch or detailed as you want it to be. But obviously, the more detailed you make the outline, the more information you already have prepared for yourself when you start to draft the essay itself. And sometimes it's just a fake out. Sometimes it's simply, it's almost like if we tell ourselves it's just an outline. This is just to help me stay on track. We can put a lot of effort into that outline. We can put a lot of detail, a lot of organization, and a lot of specific information on that outline. Because when we tell ourselves it's time to write the essay, we freeze up. There's panic, there's anxiety, there's doubt. But telling ourselves it's just an outline allows us to take so much of the information that is needed when we draft to get it down on paper, and then the drafting doesn't have to be as anxious. You basically just faked yourself out. You still did all the same things that you would have to do when you draft the essay, but you did it in an outline form, and that doesn't seem so bad. That's not writing an essay. That's just making an outline. Like, I can do that. You still have to kind of psych yourself up, pump yourself up to start the draft, but once you start it, that outline, you're going to see how much easier it makes your process. All right. In this case too, you've got your source information on your outline, or at least you've made notes of which sections you're going to have source information. As you're drafting this time, you're incorporating the source information as you go, and you're providing the citations as you go. It just makes it easier. But remember, like we learned last week, having the reference entries done first will help you make sure that those citations are correct. All you got to do is look at the reference entry and know exactly what to put in the parentheses. No hesitation. You'll have it. All right. This outline, again, a little more time up front creating the outline, but should most definitely save you significant time in the drafting process and probably the revision process too. Because if you have a very structured, detailed outline from the get-go, you probably will end up with a better version of your rough draft, which means less revisions you'll have to do once I read it. So just something to think about. But at the very least, if the detailed outline is not your thing, for whatever reason, maybe it's just a time issue, honestly, at least try the scratch outline. It will still save you tremendous time down the road. Remember while you're drafting to respect your sources. So think back to our lesson on using sources and avoiding plagiarism. So the most important step in respecting your sources as you're drafting is remembering to provide the in-text citations every time you incorporate information from a source. No matter if it's a summary, no matter if it's a paraphrase, no matter if it's a direct word-for-word quote, citation, citation, citation. The next step is making sure that all of your citations match up to your reference entries for each source. Now remember, if you did the reference entries first, like we learned, and you used that to create your citations, then everything should match up. The next step is making sure that all the sources on your reference list have been cited at least once. Remember, everything has to match up. But don't forget about the other source abuses that we learned about last week, 2 weeks ago as well. Don't use source information inaccurately. Make sure you fully understand the information you're using and that you don't twist it accidentally or misrepresent the author's original intention. Don't use source information out of context. Don't take half of a sentence and make it seem like it's saying something it really doesn't. Don't overuse source material. Remember, you don't want it to look like a string of citations in a paragraph. It's supposed to be mostly your ideas and words. Make sure you aren't plunking source material, especially direct quotes. Remember, you got to introduce and integrate the information into your own sentences, provide the information from the source, and then follow up on that information, right? You have to explain it, connect it to your main point. Don't use blanket citations, right? Meaning don't just put a citation at the end of the paragraph to give credit to a source that was used somewhere in the paragraph. No, the citation has to appear immediately at the source information. And be sure you don't rely too heavily on just one source, right? If you have 3 sources, and you find yourself using one of them over and over again, ask yourself why. There should be a really good reason, and you might want to run it by me. You don't want to overuse any one source. All right. Make sure that you're reasoning with the evidence. You want and your support. You're choosing to use this source information for a reason. So make it a part of your discussion. Like if you were talking to me about this topic, you would, and you had read this article, you would discuss it with me. You'd explain, you wouldn't just randomly give a quote from it and then move on. You would explain it and you would connect it to the conversation that we're having. So make sure that you're doing that in well-developed paragraphs. Make sure that each paragraph has a topic sentence, that you are reasoning with the evidence, and that it has a each paragraph has a concluding sentence. Don't forget the basics of essay writing. Transitional topic sentences. Each paragraph should have focus. Each paragraph should have specific and adequate support. That support should be a mixture mostly of your own supporting ideas, but with some supporting source ideas as well. Make sure the paragraphs have coherence and make sure they have good sentence skills. Don't forget, just because it's a research paper doesn't mean you don't have to remember that it's also an essay. Make sure you have all the elements of an essay. Skip that one right here. We're going to go to using source material in your writing. So we've talked about this before. You know, you have your sources and you've got to figure out what information you're actually going to pull from each source. Make sure whatever information you're choosing from a source, make sure it's for the right reasons. Again, make sure that it deepens and develops the main point you're making at that spot in the essay. Don't just include a quote or a paraphrase for the heck of it, just because you're required to have a certain amount. No, choose the information from the essay that made you want to use it as a source in the first place, right? Make sure that it supports your point and your thinking, that it gives credibility to your ideas, that it helps bring your point to life. Make sure you use quotation restraint, right? Only use direct quotes if it's almost like perfectly said. You can't really think of a way to reword it. It's just so succinct, it's so pithy, it's just perfect. Or if it's complex ideas, sometimes you have to give a direct quote for something that is really hard to understand so that the reader can see the original quote and then you can explain it. And then it actually makes more sense than trying to paraphrase it on your own at first. Most of the time, though, you want paraphrase and summary. Remember, those direct quotes should be used sparingly, only when necessary. You want smooth integration. You want to start each paragraph with your own topic, transitional topic sentence, your own ideas. You have to set up the idea that you're talking about, the main idea in that section. And then you introduce and integrate the source. You give the summary, paraphrase, or direct quote with the citation. And then you explain it, you expand on it, you connect it, right? We're going to look specifically at how to smoothly integrate source material, how to really think about doing a summary, especially how to go about creating a decent paraphrase of source material, how to incorporate direct quotes. That's going to be in the next lesson on integrating sources, okay? So this lesson hopefully gives you some ideas about how to start organizing and approaching the draft of your essay. The next lesson on integrating sources will then help you gain some confidence in how to mesh that source information with your own writing, okay? All right, so if you have any questions about any of this stuff, let me know. Otherwise, you